Welcome to this week's episode of The Rutledge Perspective, and I am absolutely thrilled to have my guest, Nicole Walker, on the show this week. I actually met her by attending one of her workshops at the Black Podfest and was immediately a kindred spirit because this woman does data, and I loved it. So I'm going to introduce you to her really quickly, and then we are going to dive in. So Nicole is an award-winning podcaster, global influencer, international speaker, podcast launch coach, and women empowerment advocate. She attributes much of her success to starting her podcast, WinHers United, and often talks about how podcasting literally changed her life. Her podcast has received numerous accolades, such as being ranked in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And she is a winner of the 2020 Best Black Business Podcast Award, among so many other things. And I'm going to put her full bio in the show notes. But for now, we're going to dive into this conversation. Nicole, welcome to the Rutledge Perspective.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, this is going to be great. So, when we got a chance to talk, I went to your session and you were telling us about all this data and where you could see things and how you could get information on where your podcast was. And you showed us about listen notes, which I'd never even heard of. And I looked out there and I'm like, oh, I'm in the top 10%. And I thought this made my whole podcast. And so even though through the data and being a data-driven person, even through the data, you talked about using your podcast to connect with people, having pop-up podcasts, connecting with your audience, celebrating things with them. You talk about podcasting as a people thing. So first things first, how do you take this podcast thing and have that be a part of your vision around aligning people?
Oh my goodness. Well, let's just talk about how it's amazing. You never know the impression that you leave upon people, right? Because I never heard that, but I'll receive it.
Yes.
Right. And I'm going to wear it with a badge of honor. Right.
Good.
So thank you. Right. So
You're
I'll just take a step back, right? Mm-hmm. Connecting people has always been my thing prior to me even knowing what podcasting was, right? Prior to becoming a podcaster, I always loved to host events, bring people together. I love to see the relationships that build based on the people that come together, like who decides to have which conversations and how people bounce around from person to person, right? So that's always been a thing for me. And I have somewhat of a photographic memory at times, right? So certain things about people will stick out to me, right? So I'm very good at, someone's on my podcast. I know they work in X area. If I hear someone looking for that person, I'll put their name in the hat, right? Yeah. If someone's looking for a service that someone, I know offers, I'll put that person's name in a hat, right? So it's always been my thing, right? Like love people, love being around people. And the podcasting just really brought that to life for me because I was in a place where I surrounded myself with people that didn't really bring out the best in me. I didn't get all the good vibes. I felt like I was around people that really didn't like me. Right. And I wanted to change that. So I decided to go into this women empowerment, right? Feeling like we should really just big each other up, love on each other, celebrate each other. Right. So then going into the celebration, I like the hook. All I do is win, no matter what, right? Like, yes. So that's like, I love that, right? So I love to celebrate. And I believe it helps to bring sunshine to a rainy day. It is a form of gratitude, right? So I believe in celebrating the big things as well as the small things. Because I feel like a lot of times in life, we rush, and we're waiting for this super goal, or what do they say? The big audacious goal to happen. That we overlook these smaller goals that are leading to the bigger goal, but that are a part of our life's journey and super, super important, because who's to say we'll ever get to the goal? I want to say we will, but that's not promised, right? But what is promised is what's happening right here, right now, and it all deserves to be celebrated.
I just love that. I love that. And as we talk about here on the Rutledge Perspective, these journeys, and everybody's journey is different, and there's so much learning in each of our journeys, right? And so for you always love people, that connecting people, but you also had the insight, as you just said, to say, you know what? I was at a time in my life where I just wasn't surrounded by people who gave me good vibes, right? These are people who I didn't think liked me. They clearly weren't lifting me up. Talk to people a little bit about the power of, one, that recognition, and then two, having the courage to do something about that.
Right. Okay. So, and yeah, that is totally real, right? So I think the recognition, right? Like that's a thing within itself, right? Because a lot of people live in misery, but they don't realize they're in misery, right? So for me, it was a point in time where I was functionally depressed, right? But I didn't know that I was functionally depressed because it was my normal, right? And it took for me to, I'll never forget, one day I looked myself in the mirror and I said, this is not my life. Right. Like I don't have to accept this. Right. And I had to realize that I didn't have to accept it. Right. And it's a power just in that, because it's like, okay, well, if I don't have to accept it, then what can I create? What can I create? Right. Like we are so powerful and we have the power to create what we want. But we first have to realize that we can create what we want. And even maybe a step before that, realize that we're not happy where we are and accept that, right? Because a lot of people, you know, I mean, I like to fake it till you make it, but sometimes you can't fake it, right? Like I have a love-hate kind of thing for that, that saying, right? Because some things aren't to be fake. Some things are to be accepted, you know, and then you figure out another course, right? And it's okay because that acceptance can be super hard, and it allows a lot of people to live in ignorance for their entire life, right? So it's super amazing. It's super freeing. And again, it took that acceptance of this is not okay for me. You know, it might have been okay in my teens. It might have been okay in my early 20s. It might have been okay in my early 30s. But now I want something different, and I can have something different. There is something different in the world, right? Because sometimes you think, oh, this is how everyone is. No, it's not.
No,
it is not.
It's not.
That's a lie. Right. It's not, right? So it might be everyone you know because you're so down in that circle, right? But that means getting out of that comfort zone of those people that you know. And for me, that was really starting my podcast and interviewing women of color entrepreneurs, meeting all of these women. Like most of my network are people that I met from podcasting or attending podcast conferences, women events, business events, right? And it just put me around a totally different sphere of people. Like I say, podcasting catapulted me into a different realm. It catapulted me into a different realm that I didn't even realize existed, right? Funny story. So when I went out to start my podcast, I thought that I was the first person in the world creating a women empowerment podcast, right? Because, you know, because it wasn't a thing in my life, right? Like if you don't know it exists, if you don't know it exists, right?
Right. Yes.
So I said, instead of thinking, I didn't even think, let me go find it. I thought, let me go create it. Right. And from creating that, I was then introduced to all of these other people, you know, that are in this space that I put myself in, and I'm super grateful for that. So, you know, just going back, having that acceptance and then having the courage, right? And accepting that it may be lonely. It may be lonely in the beginning until you find your tribe and you find your people, and you may continue to attract the wrong kind of people initially because you might have some bad juju's going on with you. So you might have to do some healing within yourself, you know, to then attract the right kind of people.
And that is so powerful because one, sometimes it's hard to move out of your circle, right? Because even if the circle doesn't feel good, it's the circle, you know, it's that whole, the enemy we know kind of thing, right? Where we stay in that space because as uncomfortable as it may be, there's comfort in that discomfort. And so looking to expand and to move requires us being willing to be uncomfortable. And so when you talk about, hey, I'm going to start this empowerment, you know, women's empowerment thing and thinking that I was the first person doing it, talk a little bit about the power of ignorance. That's what I'm going to call it, right? The power of ignorance, because there are 7 billion people. Nothing is new, as they say. There's nothing new in the world. And we always think, because we're both data people, right? Get the data, get the information, because once you have the information, then you can move. But I would offer that probably not knowing was the greatest thing that could have happened to you in terms of being creative and moving to this next space?
Right. I love that question. Right. And it was a form of ignorance. So
Mm-hmm.
something that I've said many times, like on a lot of my earlier podcast episodes, is
Mm-hmm.
no one can ever say that I copied off of them in relation to my podcast, right? Because I
Right.
literally never listened to a podcast
Right.
prior to creating my own, right? So that was a
Yes.
form of ignorance, right? Like I didn't
Yes.
know, I didn't listen to podcasts, which is funny because my coaching
Mm-hmm.
clients, I encourage them to listen to other people's podcasts and check them out
Yes.
and do that market research, right? Something I didn't
Mm-hmm.
do that I know is good for when you're entering into the market,
Right.
right? But I didn't do that. Right. So a form of ignorance that allowed me to jump. Right. Because let's say
Mm-hmm.
I did do it. Let's say I was intimidated by what I heard. Let's say I felt
Right.
like I had to be better than these people and I didn't know how to be better than these people. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
that not knowing gave me, I guess you could say, a courage, right? Like a
Mm-hmm.
courage to move forward, right? I just knew
Yeah.
what I wanted, right? I wanted something
Yes.
better. And the only thing I knew was to create it. Like that was what came to me. Create it, not
Right.
go look for it, amongst other people, create it
Mm-hmm.
yourself. So one of the things that I held on to was be the change you want to see, right? Like this was my
Yes.
way of being the change I wanted to see. And I'm grateful that
Mm-hmm.
it was, in sense, me not knowing, because what if I would have jumped into someone's circle and kind of became a wallflower, or something like
Yes.
that, right? It allowed me to allow my light to shine, because that was a big thing for
Yes.
me too. Like a lot of times I play small, and it's still something that I struggle with, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I play small because I don't want to intimidate people, right? I
Right.
want people to like me, right? And I don't always want to stand out, but I had to
Mm-hmm.
accept that I am a bright light. I stand out
Yes.
whether I want to or not, right? And then it's a quote by Marianne Williamson that where she talks about when you allow your light to shine, you give
Mm-hmm.
other people their permission, right? So that
Yes.
particular part of her quote gave me the power, because then it was like, oh, well, it's not just about me. I'm also
Mm-hmm.
helping someone else. Right. So just
Yes.
going back to that, helping someone else. Yeah. So, not being able to do the comparison game and
Mm-hmm.
not knowing it existed, like gave me a new lease on life, right? Because podcasting helped me to get over depression, right?
Yes.
It was one of the catalysts that helped me to get over alcohol and drug abuse, right? Like it
Mm-hmm.
changed so many aspects of my life, right? So I'm so glad that I
Yeah.
didn't think that it existed, what I was doing, because sort of
Yes.
like how they say, a lot of people feel like, oh, I can't create my business because it's a million other businesses out there,
Mm-hmm.
but nobody
Mm-hmm.
is you, right? So had I
Yes.
known, all of the places that were out there, I may have felt like it was no room for me in the market,
Right.
right? But there is
Right.
room for me in the market, right? So that's where
Yes.
that ignorance turned out to be such a blessing.
Yes. And it's so powerful, all that you just said, because we often forget that, yes, there are 7 billion people, and there's probably at least half of those doing the same thing that you're doing or trying to do the same thing that you're doing. But no one does it like you. No one does it like you. And the only way to serve is to be out there, right? It's not about us. It's to be out there. And so I so totally relate to that, because starting the business, coming out of corporate, I didn't know anything about, online, nothing, right? I had a Facebook page under duress. I was only on social media because my salsa group, that's where they posted the rehearsals, right? That was it. I wasn't trying to be on social media. And my personal page is still private because I need a minute. But that whole idea of stepping into something we don't know, but at least having the courage to do that and taking that first step can take you to places that you never even imagined were possible. Never even imagined. So if you talk about how this podcasting completely changed, your life and your trajectory and lifted you out of depression, how are you taking that now and using that as this next kind of journey for you? How is that becoming that foundation for you for what you're wanting to do and how you're wanting to serve?
Yeah. So great question, right? Totally ties in. It's so interesting, right? Because what I
Yeah.
do, right? When you said my bio, podcast
Mm-hmm.
launch coach, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't start out to be a podcast launch coach. Right. International speaker. I didn't start out to be an international speaker. Right. I just decided to start a podcast, interview women of color entrepreneurs because it was part of my aspirations. So I wanted to learn more about women in business. And then also because leadership, when I went to school for my MBA, I took a class. My first class was leadership. That leadership class chewed me up, spit me around, spit me out. It let me know that I was not the leader I thought I was. Right. And I feel like a lot of people aren't the leaders they think they are. Right. And I wanted to listen, and I wanted to spread some of this knowledge. Right. Like, doesn't mean you're a bad person. Right. But it does mean that you have room to grow. And it's okay, right? So I wanted to spread leadership knowledge. I wanted to learn more about women of color entrepreneurs and spread this information to the world, right? So fast forward a year later, a few months later, I applied to be a speaker in Canada. I got chosen, right? Hence international speaker. And then it catapulted my speaking career, right? And about a year, maybe a year and a half later, people started asking me to teach them how to podcast, right? So backstepping again. So when I did start my podcast, I wanted to also start a leadership development company, so I got the website created. I was so ready, but I didn't do anything. Like, I didn't market myself. I didn't go out to try to find clients. Like, I didn't do anything with it. And who's to say, if I'll pick it back up or not, but I didn't do anything with it. And then what I made myself known for began to chase me down, right? So they always say, like, if you don't know what to start a business about or where to start a business, what are people asking you for? That's where you start. What do people want from you? And people wanted podcast knowledge from me, right? So it turned into its own thing. And then fast forward some more, like, as I continue to speak at different places, I would talk about just a lot of podcasting conferences I spoke at. I would talk about different things in podcasting, but then I finally decided to marry podcasting and data because I went to my bachelor's degree is in computer science, always loved data. In corporate America, I do a lot of data analysis, a lot of business analysis, right? And these are skills that I have that I love. And then I just, no, not even that. Going back to what you did, people see things in you that you don't necessarily see in yourself. So one of my previous podcast guests who turned into a friend in real life, she asked me to speak at her event and she said, I want you to talk on monitoring your podcast. I was like, right? So then I created a talk for her crew or for her group or for her conference on monitoring your podcast. And it just catapulted into this whole thing in relation to podcasting and data analytics, right? So, and that's just a short, like, I've been featured in a book, like just a short version of what happened, but like none of this was on my radar. Like, really what was on my radar was helping people to think better and lead themselves better, and also show women that we don't have to be so catty, we can be more collaborative, right? And it turned into this whole thing that's just super amazing.
Well, and that's such a word, y'all. I hope you guys are listening to this. That is such a word. If you don't know what you're going to do, what are people asking you for? And what is your genius? So for those of you who've read The Big Leap, not necessarily your zone of excellence, because that's the stuff you're really good at, but it doesn't like feed your soul, but your real genius. And if you listen to what Nicole just said, that whole marrying her data and her understanding of analytics and her real drive for understanding that, her excellence at that, and her genius at connecting people and networking and wanting people to understand and wanting to make sure people are connected. So she married her excellence with her genius. And look what she's doing. Because I'm telling you guys, for someone who is a data person, I'm all about data and facts, and let's just get the truth. And then we can do something with that. Or we can decide we don't care, right? But at least we have it. This thing that you did, this workshop you did, which, by the way, still in the top 10%. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Perspective.
Yes.
And my listening score even went up by 1. Right.
Oh,
so I'm like,
okay.
It's at least 1. It's at least 1. But this whole idea of taking what you know and what you're good at and marrying that with what makes your soul sing, because when you show up that way, people are drawn to that. They are drawn to that. And so when you think about how you've married all this stuff and then people coming to you and asking you for it. And this shift, right? You spent time, I'm sure you spent time and money and effort to build this website for this other thing. How did you get your mind wrapped around, you know what? This is the shift I'm supposed to make? Because sometimes we get caught up in the stuff that we spend all our time and money on and get upset, and we get frozen because it wasn't the thing we thought, where we can't see the genius that's coming. How did you allow yourself to be open to the new thing and not get tied to that thing you'd already created?
Listen, Laura, let's just talk about these questions now. I'm loving these questions and the lead through and the lead up and the tie together. You know, I just had to make an acknowledgement of that. It's amazing. Amazing. So that is not easy, right? Like you said, right? And in true transparency, I didn't want to. I didn't want to, right? So in a way, I sort of like kicking and screaming, right? Yeah. And I think I'm just getting to a place where I'm like, okay, I'll allow this to be my thing, right? Because it wasn't what I thought, you know? And sometimes we get so caught up on what we think a thing should be, or the goal. No, we don't think about the goal. We think about how the goal, like the steps to the goal.
Yes.
Right. So we get caught up on the steps that, like, because in my head, this is what it looked like. Right. Even though you're still getting to that goal, it just may not look the way you think it should look in getting there. Right. And that's a hard thing to let go of. But I will say that sometimes if you don't let go, you won't get to your goal. Right. So being able to be flexible, you know, being able to change and flow. So like the river, right? Like being like that. Right. And as I'm talking to you, I'm talking to me. Right. So not look,
welcome to my world.
Let you know.
Physician, heal thyself.
Listen, right. So I'll never forget my first podcast coaching client. Well, even before that. So I was supposed to put out a webinar, right? So my webinar, I think it was supposed to come out in June. And for whatever reason, I talked myself out of June, and then it was supposed to come out in July and blah, blah, blah. Fast forward, I finally put it out in August of that year, right? But even before that, someone that was asking me to teach her about podcasting, negative self-talk, something I deal with all the time, you know, doubt, fear, all of those things that anyone in the entrepreneurship world, you know, it's a thing, and it always is a thing. You just continue to talk yourself out of it. Right. Yes. So, you know, I told her I would, what have you. Then I still didn't believe. Right. So I started to send her resources from other people, you know, because none of this stuff is, like you said, it's not new under the sun. Right. It's out there. Right. I started to send her resources, whatever, you know, and then she would still ask me, and I'm like, I sent you the thing. She was like, yeah, no, I'll wait for you, you know, and I think that, and it was like, I was blown away because, like, I'm charging you money. What I'm sending you is a free resource, right? You don't even want this free resource. You want me. Like that blew my mind, like total, you know, what's the emoji, the mind blown emoji? Listen, total mind blown. And excuse me. And it really just sort of like let me know, you know, that Nicole, you have what it takes, right? Like I really need that. You needed that. You have what it takes. And that was one of the catalysts that pushed me forward and allowed me to go forward. And I started off with giving a webinar, and then, you know, transitioned into coaching, and still, even after coaching a few clients, still was struggling, right? Because one of my other aspirations was to start a women empowerment group. So like a women business group, right? Again, I told you my background is in business analysis. I have my master's in business administration, right? So sometimes it's so tough when you're knowledgeable in many different areas, because it's like, okay, I know a lot of things. Like, where do I choose? Which way do I go? Right. And I struggle with that, you know, and sometimes I still struggle with it. Right.
Yes.
So so I thought about doing this women empowerment group, and really was fighting with that, because I felt like my podcast had to match my business, and my podcast is about women empowerment. And then how am I going to be teaching people how to launch a podcast? Like, it doesn't make sense, you know. Then it just took, for me, it has to, like I said, make sense, right? So then I realized that my podcast could be a funnel to my business, right? So I'm interviewing potential clients for my business, right? So I could still have this podcast, right? And I can walk forth in this podcast coaching and helping people with podcast strategy, growth, and analytics, right? And then another thing that I also have to continue to get past is that I know some things, but I don't know all the things, right? So then it's like, well, how can I really teach people the things? And I'll never forget one of the women that I spoke with before. She goes, Nicole, you may not know all the things, but let's just equate it to basketball. She said, let's say you just know how to dribble. You don't know how to shoot three pointers, right? Well, you could teach somebody that don't know how to dribble, right? You don't have to worry about the fact that you can't do threes right now because they can't even dribble, so realizing that there's stages and there's levels to everything. And even though you might not feel like you're on the level you want to be on, you're on a level higher than someone else, right? And that person may need you, to get them to that level, right? So that was my long-winded answer.
That was perfect because, and this is like one of the best interviews and one of the hardest because you've got so much stuff. I'm like, I could talk to you for 4 hours. This whole idea of marrying the pieces of your podcast, right? Having it be a funnel, having that mind shift of what you can serve and what you can deliver, right? And so being able to shift and say, and be flexible enough, intellectually agile enough to say, wait, I don't have to not do my podcast. I just have to change what my podcast means to my overall business structure. The podcast isn't going away. I'm just changing what I'm using it for. And that whole idea of what I had a friend that says, we just need to think about what it is. Be focused on your vision. I call it your vision, right? Clarify your vision. Be focused on the vision. The how will take care of itself. How you get it done, that'll come. Just know your what. Know what it is you're trying to do. And so we got to allow ourselves that flexibility. And I think you have demonstrated so much of that in your work around, I did this because it was something I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn about women entrepreneurs, in particular, Black women entrepreneurs. So I started this thing where I could learn, and it turned into something else that I allowed to manifest, right? And I have a real weird relationship with that manifest word, but I'll use it in this context. So Nicole, as we begin to wrap up, because again, I could be on with you for the next 4 hours. If you think about everything you've done and where you are now, what has been for you the biggest learning, even if it's one or two things, the biggest learning in getting to where you are on this journey?
So the biggest learning I would say is, so it's so funny. Well, look, we could be here for hours with this question, right? Because, I realized that my podcast, I thought it was for other people, but it was really for me because I learned so much from them, right? But one of the things that a person I call my podcast mentor, right? So he talks about starting ugly, and a lot of times we, analysis paralysis. Oh, I got to get it to this point before I can launch the thing, right? Like I can't put it out because it's not perfect, when there's learning and doing, right? There's learning and doing. So a lot of times we got to jump out the window, and allow ourselves to make mistakes, right? To sometimes fail, right? And learn those valuable lessons and then implement what we've learned to continue to get better, right? So that's been a super, super huge thing that I've learned along the journey. Another thing I've learned along the journey is just defining success for yourself, right? Because even, we talked about podcast analytics, right? So funny. I was doing some research earlier today on analytics, and they're talking about downloads. And it was so interesting because this is something that's big in the podcast world. Like people really equate their success to downloads, right? But I truly believe that success is what you define success to be, right? And for some people, success is just getting out the bed in the morning. Success is making their bed, right? Like that's what success is for some people. So, and who am I to say that that's not success for them? Like that's not, they're not successful, right? They are, right? So really defining success for myself. I'm a competitive person by nature, right? But I compete with me, I don't compete with other people, right? Like, how can I outdo what Nicole did yesterday or last week or last month or last year, right? And not allowing, and again, I'm a work in progress, right? Because social media had you second guessing your whole life.
Your very existence.
Listen, it will have you like, oh my goodness, I'm not doing anything with myself. Let me just crawl in a hole and just stay there, right?
Exactly.
So I'm not perfect in this area, right? But reminding myself, like, Nicole, is this what you want to do, right? Is this what makes you feel good? Is this what drives you? Does this go along with your values, right? So really, defining success for myself, not allowing myself to be strayed too far to the left or right based on what everyone else in the world is doing, right? And to not get stuck in that analysis paralysis, and to get out there and try new things. And if I fail, figure out what needs to be fixed and continue forth.
Oh, I love that. I love that, because that start ugly, right? I think what I heard one time was imperfect action is better than perfect inaction, right? And I know me, I want it because the other tape that's playing is, you only get one time to make a first impression, right? It's got to be your brand. You got to make sure it reflects who you want to be. Okay, well, yeah, I guess that's true. But part of reflecting who you are is being vulnerable enough to show imperfection.
Right.
How about that? Right. Because none of us is perfect. And so it's okay if, I looked at my first podcast the other day. I was like, oh, Lord.
Listen.
Put that out there.
Right. Nothing will humble you like your first podcast episode.
But I still get comments on it like, oh, that was so good. And I'm like, really?
Right.
Did you listen to my first podcast? Right. But because I think our experience gets better and our expectations get higher. We go back. We got to be careful not to go back in hindsight and judge early based on now.
Right.
And that's really hard. That's really hard. So I've got all the information on how people can get in touch with you, but for giving somebody like a really good piece of advice who is saying, I really have been thinking about a podcast, but there are, millions and millions and millions of podcasts out there. And I don't know if that makes sense for me. What is a piece of advice that you would give to somebody who's really thinking about jumping into this podcast journey?
Listen, I keep it very simple. We're going to quote Nike and say, just do it. Right. I truly believe that the ideas and the aspirations that come to us don't come to us by happenstance. Right. I believe they come to us for a reason. Again, going back to everybody has a thing, right? I'll never forget. I saw a meme. I talk meme a lot because memes really speak to me. Right.
Me too.
Listen. So I never forget. I saw the meme where, they said if Rihanna worried about how many makeup brands were out, Fenty wouldn't be a thing, right? And then I saw that, right? Listen, that changed my life, because that was part, like we all go through that, right? So yes, there are millions of podcasts out there, but there's only one you, right? So it's so funny. My podcast episode that comes out this week is entitled "You Are the It Factor." Oh. Right. You are the it factor. Yes. Listen, right. Yes. So it's you, it's your personality, right? And allowing yourself to be you, right? Because coming from a place of corporate America, when I first started, my podcast sounds a lot more businessy than it does now, right? Because in corporate America, you have to, tighten up your tie and, make sure especially as a person of color, right? And I brought that into my land of podcasting, but then I had to get comfortable with, Nicole, just because you don't know how to enunciate every word, which I say, God, why did you choose me to be a podcaster? Because I don't even know how to pronounce this stuff the way it's supposed to be pronounced, but here I am and I'm moving, in this life.
Absolutely.
Right. So,
such similar journeys, right? Because that corporate thing, like you're saying, just get out there and do it. Just do it. Just do it.
Right. Even if you do some research on what's out there, how can you put your spin on it? What podcast do you love? And what do you think should be different about it? Right. Well, create one and make yours the way you think that one should be different. Right. So I always say, just do it. Of course, I'm going to say, hire a coach, right? It's so funny. I saw a post the other day that said starting a podcast is similar to starting a business. And I know when I wanted to start my business, I hired me a business coach, right? So I'll just say again, hire you a podcast coach. If you can't afford a coach, attend workshops, go on YouTube, do some reading, right? Go to podcast conferences, just get as much knowledge as you can. And I would even say you don't have to get all of that knowledge before you start, right? Like get a little bit of knowledge, start, and continue to get knowledge as you go, because I don't want you sitting on this podcast idea for 10 years, right? Like let's make this thing happen.
And what I would add to what Nicole said, don't go buy up Guitar Center with equipment to do this podcast.
No.
That's not necessary. I've got more LED cameras and tripods and green screen mess that I didn't need. I got my little Yeti. I've got my Zoom. And it works just fine. Now, might I upgrade? Absolutely. I will upgrade. I've got a pop filter and all that kind of stuff. I will upgrade. But don't think you got to buy the store to start. That's another blocker that's just keeping you stuck. That's keeping you stuck.
I started my podcast for less than $200. Listen.
That's what I'm saying. Right. Catch the sale, buy the mic, right? You do need a good mic because sound is everything. Get a good mic and go. Just go. Because you don't necessarily have to have a camera if you don't want to do video. I just happen to be doing video. You don't have to have a camera. Do your audio and keep it moving, right? Nicole, we just have to do it again because this wasn't enough. So we have to do it again.
Yay. I love that.
We have to do it again. And I am so appreciative that you spent this time with us, that you have shared your knowledge, and especially about this journey of just doing it, right? And doing the research and finding it out, and how you don't have to know everything to start, because sometimes we get caught up in, I don't know enough, especially those of us coming out of corporate who have been trained to get a lot of information right before you move. So try to manage your risk aversion and try to step into that genius that is you, and go follow Nicole, go get her podcast, go download. I'm going to have her come back and talk about, for those of you who are data driven like me, we're going to come back and talk about this whole data thing and the download versus no downloads and how. Okay, we're going to talk about all of that at another time, but go get her podcast, go listen to it. She has had some incredible guests. You want to do that, follow her. I'm going to have all her information in the show notes. Go check her out. And if you are thinking about starting a podcast, go talk to Nicole. Hire yourself a coach, figure out how to do it. Nicole, thank you.
Thank you so much. It has been so awesome.
It has. And we will catch you guys next time. Thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Go ahead out there on your favorite platform. Give us a 5-star review. Send me some DMs with some things you want me to talk about, or some people you think I should interview. I'd love to hear from you. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. You have been listening to the Rutledge Perspective podcast. Thank you so much for downloading and for connecting. You can find previous episodes of the podcast on my website at laurelrutledge.com/podcast. You can also find me on social media at Laurel K. Rutledge and/or the Rutledge Perspective. And I'd love your perspective on the things we talk about. And if there's a specific topic you want me to cover, just let me know. And please share this podcast with someone in your village who may need this little piece of perspective today. And if you're so inclined, I would really appreciate a 5-star rating and review on the platform of your choice. Apple Podcasts and Spotify reviews are particularly helpful. Thank you again for listening. Take care.